Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today I am really excited that we have two presenters who we're going to hear from. So today's presentation is being jointly delivered by Dr. Sophie Curtis-Ham and also by Ryan Jones, who both work in the Research and Insights team at New Zealand Police. Sophie is also an honorary research associate with Te Puna Haumaru, our institute at the University of Waikato. So Sophie has engaged in research spanning evidence-based policing, investigative and forensic psychology, crime science and environmental criminology, while Ryan's work has focused on translating data into actionable insights to support strategic decision-making across police. Both have really impressive backgrounds and are true experts in the area, so it's a privilege to hear from them today.
Thanks, April. Kia ora koutou, I'm Sophie Curtis-Ham, lead research insights here at Evidence-Based Policing in New Zealand Police, and I'm joined by...
Kia ora, so I'm Ryan Jones, I'm a senior advisor in the research insights team, as mentioned in Evidence-Based Policing.
Cool, so I'm going to open things up and then Ryan will chat through a few things and I'll come back in at the end. And what we're here today to present to you on is around a method for moving beyond crime counts in several ways, through introducing you to a tool that we at Evidence-Based Policing have developed called the Police Response Effort Index, and we call that the PREI for short. So when I say PREI, that's what I'm talking about. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue as easily maybe as Crime Harm Index or CHI, but that's the best we could come up with by way of a catchy-ish acronym for this tool that we've developed. And we'll talk a little bit about the Crime Harm Index as well along the way, because the two are very much interlinked. Okay, so we're going to cover a few different topics to give you a background to why we've developed this tool. What is it? How exactly did we go about creating it? How to apply it in practice, and a few kind of use case examples that illustrate the kind of insights you can generate with your analysis of crime or policing demand if you're using this tool, and then signal a bit about what's next on the agenda for it. Okay, so why have this thing called the PREI? Well, it's all about the fact that increasingly these days, as we're well aware, the demand for police service is complex and multifaceted. There are a lot of things that police gets called to that go beyond just sort of investigating crime, and even within that crime demand, not everything is equal. And we need a way of kind of incorporating that nuance into analysis of crime and demand to be able to respond to it. So we have all sorts of things that people call police about, not just crime, and some of these things are quite complex and time-consuming, like responding to family harm call-outs, people in mental health crisis, and missing persons, for example. And all these different demands take different levels of effort for police to resolve. And so we need to account for that. We can't treat them all equally when counting how much demand is placed on police and trying to allocate resource and that sort of thing accordingly. We have these traditional methods of analysing these demands for police service or police demand, and that ranges from sort of the most basic in terms of just counting these things up. How many calls for service have we received? How many crime reports have there been? And treating all those pretty equally, or bundling them into broader, quite large categories, even such as burglary or theft. And that sort of doesn't capture that nuance in terms of different subtypes of crime or specific demands. So that prompted the development some years ago now of these things called Crime Harm Indices, which some of you already may be quite familiar with and others maybe not. So we'll talk a little bit about the history there because it's sort of limitations of crime harm indices that then prompted us to develop the police response effort index. So a crime harm index allows you to weight each different crime type by an estimate of the harm involved in that crime type relative to other crime types. So it's sort of about relative harm. We can't get an estimate of sort of the absolute harm associated with every single offence. And so given these relate to crime harm, and typically, and there are various crime harm indices available around the world. They're started in Cambridge in the UK. We have one that we developed for New Zealand. All sorts of jurisdictions have them now, but they all stem from sentencing for crime. And so they either reflect sentencing guidelines, talking about how long a person would spend in prison, following sentencing guidelines for a given type of offence, or, as is the case with our New Zealand Crime Harm Index, it's based on actual sentencing data to come up with an estimate of how much time someone would spend in prison if they were being sentenced for that offence, sort of on average. And so a big limitation there is that we're just talking about crime. We've only got sentences, naturally, for things that people have been prosecuted through the courts for, like crimes, and we're not capturing or able to weight the harm associated with or other aspects of all those other different types of demand for police service that don't actually relate to crime, which by and large around the world, New Zealand's no different, it's about 50-50, give or take. So about half the things we're called to might be related to crime, and maybe about half typically related to all these other demands for police service. And so we thought about different ways that we could capture the differences between all these different types of demand, and came up with this concept of capturing the effort or time involved in that initial police response to the cause for service, or sometimes it's police discovering things while they're out and about. So that's the genesis of the police response effort index, and what that's doing is it's weighting, providing a value for each crime and non-crime demand type by an estimate of the effort or time involved relative to other demand types. So quite analogous to the crime harm index, but expanded to that full set of different types of demand. And that's been around since about 2023. It's been a bit of a journey of development and rollout that I'll talk through in a bit. But just to highlight a few of the benefits of these more recent solutions to measuring crime and demand, volume counts still have their place. It's simple, it's what people are used to, and it does tell you about how many calls are coming in about the demand, and that's important to understand as well. These additional tools provide additional lenses. So we're always going to emphasise that these are not replacements. They're very much complementary and can give you additional insights and highlight things that you wouldn't necessarily have discovered if you weren't applying these additional lenses. So they can, for example, highlight how much different crime would, in the case of the PREI, the demand types are contributing to a total, say, of harm or of effort. They can help you looking at trends over time, diagnosing changes in crime makeup or demand makeup over time that would be hidden if you weren't using these tools to generate weighted counts. And you can look in terms of the three sides of the problem analysis triangle you might be familiar with, or the crime analysis triangle, around victims, offenders, and locations. So identifying high harm victims, offenders, locations times 2, and high effort, time consuming, people that are associated with time consuming types of demand, be it as sort of victim, offender, or involved in some other way, and looking at hotspots in terms of the effort and key times that we might want to, say, deploy more resources to, because those are not just peak times for volume or harm, but in terms of the time it's taking to resolve those events. Just to touch on some limitations, because not all of these tools are the one solution to everything. As mentioned, those volume counts don't account for differences between different types of demand. That's why we've developed these additional tools. And crime harm index, as mentioned, not applicable to non-crime demand types. But that doesn't mean that the effort index is a panacea. It only uses the typical time spent on police's initial response to a call for service or incident. So it's really only proxying for all the effort that goes on in relation to, say, investigation, prosecution, all that sort of stuff that follows that initial response phase. It's also descriptive and not normative, and by that we mean that it's telling us how long these different types of demand typically take to resolve, not necessarily how much time police should be spending on it. So it's describing the current state, not suggesting how things should be. So that's something to bear in mind when we talk about some of the numbers in a bit. And in terms of that bigger picture, what does having these tools actually mean and enable us to do? Well, it takes us beyond just volume, because all things are not equal. It helps those using these tools, I think, to focus on harm, focus on effort. I think it helps to support our prevention strategies and focus on victims. It gives us more nuanced measures, which is all part and parcel of what we're about with evidence-based policing, because better measures equals better evidence to inform better decisions, and those decisions can be around improving prioritisation, where we focus resource at different levels, from deciding how many officers to deploy on a given day to how many staff we might need in different teams per district, and that sort of decision as well. So what exactly does this tool look like? Well, it's actually quite simple. It's just a list of numbers. It's a spreadsheet, and there's a number for each, what we call a code, which is the type of demand. So we'll give some examples of those in a minute, but that might be for crime. Say that you'll have a code for a specific kind of burglary or robbery, different crime types, or different demand types, such as family harm, call out, mental health, missing persons, that sort of thing. And what those numbers represent, how they're calculated, is that it's the median time between police showing up and then a given what we call event being closed as resolved. That initial response phase to an typically emergency situation has finished. There may be follow-up work that needs to be done, but that initial response is recorded as closed. And the system that all that information is recorded in is called CAD, which is a computer-aided dispatch. And pretty much every police force in the world has one of these CAD systems to manage their emergency response. And they're typically capturing these times between times that the call comes in, calls that officers are dispatched, times that they arrive, times that the event is closed. So this is quite common data, and I think one of the advantages of the PREI is that it can be developed for any police force that's using one of these types of systems. Also, it's a tool for analysis. You apply these weights to some data that you have. It might be a count of incidents per type of incident, so for each of those codes. So you need that data to apply this tool to. This tool is not that data, it is not the output of applying it to the data. That's something that we sometimes get asked is, can you give me the crime harm index for this group of people, or give me the crime harm index for this location. But all we've done here is create the weighting. It's then up to people using the tool, analysts, researchers, people within police, external to police, who have some data that is worth casting this extra lens across. So that's important, I think, to get across, because it is one of the sort of frequently asked questions things. And as mentioned, and I'll keep hammering this message, it's complementary, not a replacement to your standard volume unweighted counts. And here's what it looks like. So we've got this big spreadsheet. It has each of these event codes, and for each of those we have the PREI. A little bit of nuance and tech speak here around how data operates in police for those that are joining us from outside of police. We have that CAD system that captures the calls for service and tasks that police are completing out on the street, and lots of different activities and incidents, offences, in terms of managing where all those people are dispatched to or carrying out their work at any given time. So that's CAD, and that's a really useful source of data on what's happening out there in the environment in terms of demand. We also have NIA, the National Intelligence Application, NIA, and that is our record management system that sort of picks up where CAD leaves off. It has a lot more information about the specific type of crime, the people involved, the location it happened, what was done by way of investigation, how it was resolved, all of that sort of information, much more detailed in that NIA system. So that's a really useful and rich source of information, and can give us that information about sort of those other sides of the crime triangle, the victims and the offenders, because that's not captured in CAD. So we have a version of the PREI that you can apply to your CAD data, and we have a version that you can apply to NIA data. And to give you an idea of that difference in detail, there are 156 PREI CAD codes that we have these PREI values for, and a good 7,500 codes in NIA, some of which are pretty duplicate, and maybe only about 1,000 or so are regularly used, but historically, going back in time, there have been about 7,500 codes that have been used at any given point. So that's a lot more detailed, the version of the PREI for that NIA data. But to give you an idea, hopefully these numbers make sense, that homicide is going to take longer on average for that initial response with 420 minutes than, say, a complaint of harassment or unlawful assembly. Police might rock up and things will disperse quite promptly, and some of the quickfire things to deal with, such as sort of traffic stops and that sort of thing, they often happen in a matter of a few minutes, so much less effort per incident than some of these more serious things. To give you a rundown of how we developed it, we did do a search of the literature and found that there really wasn't anything else that was plugging the gap that crime harm indices were leaving, and that we're finding, we want to include these other types of demand in analysis to paint the full picture, but we need some way of weighting those, and it didn't appear that there was any current things, so we had to do it ourselves. We did some testing, tried out a few different methods, saw what made sense, pitched it to various people sort of externally at a conference, and got some really good feedback then, and people were saying this sounds like a really useful thing. And we have put out a paper that gives us that kind of external peer review stamp of approval from the academic community, that we've followed a good method and that this looks useful. And currently we're on version 1, which is up to date and released for use. And we've also run this up the chain of command here at police to check that it's something that our own organisation is interested in us having and using. In principle, we wanted to reflect the typical initial response time, how much time officers spent on scene, excluding that travel time, and we wanted to be as granular as possible and use that CAD data for at least 1 year to control for seasonal differences. So there's more to delve into in the paper. If you want to know about the method quickly, we did use 1 year's worth of CAD data. That gives us millions of records to crunch through, and when we had codes that are actually things that don't happen that often, and we couldn't generate a median time on scene for them, then we boosted the data with a further year's worth of data. The current version is based on the financial year 23-24, or from 22-23 and 23-24 for that boosted set of codes. And as I mentioned, the NEA version is running at about 7,500 offence incident or task codes. And for those, because there's so many codes, there's quite a few cases where there's not enough, too few events to generate a median. So we impute a PREI value for those from things that are similar, based on the same grouping method as we use for the crime harm index. We've also provided PREI values for not just the things that the public call us about, but the things that police discover, or the activities that they do, which are also captured in the CAD system. Because then it's up to PREI users to decide what subsets of those sources of either reactive or proactive kind of self-generated demand they want to include in their analysis, which should be dictated by the research question. We use the median to reduce impact of outliers, and this is something that reviewers, when we went to publish the paper, kind of asked about, is why did we use closure rather than what the type of incident was coded as when the person initially called up or when the incident was first logged. And that's because our understanding of what's gone on in a given incident can change over the course of that initial response. So someone might call up and say, I've been robbed, and then police turn up and actually they've been burgled, because it's really common for people to misunderstand the difference between those two things, which is kind of a pithy example. Definitely the call takers would ask questions and try to establish whether it was robbery or what kind of offence it was. But just to show that these things can change over time, and we want the effort to index to be based on what we knew the incident or offence to be once we'd got a bit more information about what actually had occurred, because that is what we're most likely to be interested in, rather than what people thought necessarily when they first called based on more limited information. So just a bit of a nuanced point there, but quite an important one.
So sort of expanding on the table that Sophie had brought up earlier, again, when you're using the PREI, you have just sort of this more sort of spreadsheet that you incorporate into your data for each sort of thing you're wanting to count. And so again, as Sophie mentioned, it is really quite simple. You just have the count of whatever you want to look at, you times it by the weighting in the PREI, and then that gets you your total sort of effort value. So looking as, for example, again, the homicide one, if the PREI value is 420 sort of minutes, and you have 33 homicides that you're looking at in your time period, then that gives you roughly around 13,880 sort of minutes of sort of effort that police have spent on average for those 33 homicides. And then again, sort of showing the way that this can sort of, I guess, sort of like escalate or sort of show that, you know, like with the crime harm index, the more things that you're counting, the more effort you are spending. So as an example, suspicious behaviour, which is sort of a incident code where a person is called and they, you know, saw someone suspicious or saw a car that didn't know driving around, and police can go and check. We can have quite a lot of those happen. The amount of time per incident is sort of low, around, you know, sort of 17 minutes, but when you put a whole heap of them together, you can get quite a lot of time that police are actually spending doing that. And so again, sort of you would use this to sort of complement, as Sophie was saying, the crime harm index or just your counts in general, to sort of give you another dimension to look at in your analysis. And then so going into, again, some sort of more examples of how it could be used. And as Sophie said, some of these are more based on sort of like mock data or sort of preliminary sort of like testing of ideas. So not necessarily things that have exactly happened. So this first one is sort of showing again how the lens of effort can be added to add some more value to your analysis. And so in this example, we're looking at sort of the relative size of the different sort of demand problems and sort of comparing again the volume with the amount of effort. So it shows how sometimes relatively low sort of volume demand sort of categories can make up relatively higher proportions of total initial response effort, while then some higher volume categories could make up sort of lower proportions. And then so as well, some sort of the more very high harm sort of offences, so things sort of like homicide, sexual offences and that sort of thing. Again, they sort of are taking up quite a small proportion of what police are attending or doing, but the effort that is required to solve them can be quite high. So then sort of looking at, for example, they figure these sort of things around, sort of, you know, like traffic offences, suspicious behaviour, etc. Again, those are again the ones that are quite high number of the volume, but the effort's sort of low. Things like theft, family harm, they're still quite high on sort of both in terms of the police doing a lot, but the effort is still sort of more than what the volume is. Another sort of way you could look at it is sort of to try and compare by individual sort of people in a more sort of case management sort of, or like offender management sort of approach. And sort of looking at, you know, okay, the people who have committed the most offences or the most harmful offences, but you could also look and add, you know, the amount of effort police are spending to sort of interact or deal with that person. And that again, that these three sort of lenses may not all lead to the same conclusion. So just sort of pulling out, you know, that first person, the first person in this list, if you looked at just sort of volume, they're around, you know, sort of like the seventh person. So you're not sort of prioritising them as much, but you look at harm, and it's like, okay, actually they were the second most sort of harmful person. But then again, if you look at effort, and it's like, okay, now they are the number one in terms of how much effort is needed. So again, just how using these different lenses can get different sort of outcomes or different sort of outputs in helping your analysis. The next example is, again, you could use this in a more sort of like mapping way. So for people who know or might recognise, this is Christchurch. And so this was a piece of work, as again, sort of in the more testing that we did a few years ago, looking at, do the places that police are going to, do they sort of line up with sort of hotspots in terms of sort of like your volume. So in this, the red ones are the areas where there is a lot of effort but not as much volume, whereas then the blue are the ones that have got quite high volume but we're not spending actually as much time or as much effort there. And then again, sort of that these locations don't necessarily overlap and they can be quite different. A way this is sort of more becoming sort of ingrained within police is that the national sort of performance team are sort of been working on trying to sort of integrate the PREI into a more sort of like performance dashboard sort of way, so that particularly sort of like district commanders or leaders across police can have sort of more insights alongside just their volume and their harm measures. So again, this is more sort of like a hypothetical idea of how a dashboard could sort of look, and then sort of focusing on those highlighted ones of police districts of, I've got to remember the acronyms, Waikato District, Bay of Plenty, and the Eastern Police District in the North Island. That again, if you're looking at these in different ways, you can get different results. If for this example of what is called sort of public place violence offences, that sort of first row, if you just looked at that for those districts, it's sort of, showing it's steady, there's nothing super interesting to sort of look there. You add in harm, then you can sort of see, right, actually Waikato and the Eastern District, actually it's sort of more above what they might expect. That's something maybe they should start looking into. But still Bay of Plenty, they seem sort of fine. And then again, adding in effort at the bottom can show actually a different picture, that then while the numbers for Bay of Plenty, for example, are not increasing, they are spending more time doing so. And so, yeah, this isn't, I think, fully implemented, but it's the sort of way that it could be used in a more sort of tracking sort of approach. I think the sort of final example really got is sort of our evaluations and ways that we could sort of use it in a more sort of researchy sort of context. So in this particular example, it was using a synthetic control sort of method to help attribute changes in volume or effort or harm to the intervention that was being examined itself rather than any other factors. And so then looking at the figures, you've got sort of the line down in this sort of part around this is where an intervention had occurred, what was sort of the trend or happening beforehand, what's happening afterwards. And so then using this approach, you could sort of see that the volume and the effort in this case are still decreasing but being pretty consistent with what was seen pre-intervention, but the harm in particular was decreasing quite a lot post-intervention. So again, sort of being more certain that the intervention that was being looked at was sort of contributing to that change.
So as you can see, there's quite a few different ways in which people can use the PREI and try as well, if not already using it, when looking at analysing and understanding demand problems and potentially, as in that last example, evaluating the effectiveness of responses to those problems. So what we've been doing, like with that last example, is incorporating the PREI into our own work, but also supporting others around police and even some jurisdictions overseas looking to develop their own version of the effort index. So we have the NZ PREI for New Zealand, but the PREI is a kind of generic acronym, refers to the concept or the method itself. So that's been really exciting to see the uptake and interest in it. And we're definitely keen to support anyone who is wanting to use it in their analysis and hear about any additional insights that you came up with. We like good news stories to be able to hear about how it's supporting decision making in practice. And we're going to be doing a refresh. It's still relatively up to date, but we think probably needs to be refreshed every few years, or potentially tied into the refresh every few years of the Crime Harm Index as well. And we're about to release an update to that, so we figured may as well update the effort index alongside that. That's the current plan. Whether we quite make that late 2025 deadline is TBC. we're already in late 2025, so it might be early 2026. But definitely the prize, I wouldn't say it's out of date yet, being based on that financial year 23-24. Not too much happens to change the typical time that police spend on different incidents, but I'd say that probably changes more than the sentencing trends for the Crime Harm Index changes. So that is something to bear in mind as well. And it will be interesting to see in the next edition of the PREI how much some of the quite big policy changes around how we triage, particularly cause for service around mental health and family harm, have affected those initial response durations. So watch this space for updates. And I'll just end with a final hammering home of a few key messages. So tagline is that the PREI is like a crime harm index, but for police effort. And unlike the CHI, it is applicable to crime and non-crime demand. And I'd say there's a couple of golden rules if you're wanting to use these tools. Use them. Pretty much any time that you're counting crime or demand, there's the opportunity to throw on those extra couple of lenses with the CHI and the PREI and see what additional insights you can come up with, as I hope that we've been able to illustrate with those use cases. And the second is to always compare apples with apples. And that's a sort of quite technical point, but a really important one around the fact that if you're going to use these tools, then whatever rules you've applied to your data set to do your standard volume counts, say you've filtered out certain demand types, or you're counting things in a different way, a particular way. What does one incident or one row of data represent? Apply those same filters and those same counting rules across each of those lenses. Else you're not comparing apples with apples, and any additional insights or differences you may find are due to your different decisions about how you're preparing your data rather than as a result of applying those additional lenses. So I hope that makes sense, but it's something that I've had questions about and helped people applying particularly Crime Harm Index work through previously. It seems to be sometimes a little bit of a stumbling block, but just the golden rule, apples with apples, same data, just take that extra step of multiplying by your Crime Harm Index or effort index weight as part of your analysis.